Hello, my name is John Maddog Hall, and I am the program manager of Project Calwan, the executive director of Linux International, and the board chair emeritus of the Linux Professional Institute. I'm also an open source consultant for a company known as QSentinel. My talk today is about computer sovereignty. For those of you who don't know me, I have been programming since 1969. I've started out on mainframe computers. I've been doing Unix since 1980. In 1986, I met Richard Stallman and started supporting free software. And in 1994, I met Linus Torvalds and helped import Linux from being a 32-bit system to a 64-bit system, and from the Intel architecture to a RISC architecture. I've worked for a wide variety of different companies, done a wide variety of different jobs. But the thing that I'm most proud of is that I am pragmatic. I try and get the job done, no matter what it is. So for a long time, I used to talk about software freedom. But then after a while, people got confused. They thought that free software meant the software was without cost. And there's nothing that's without cost, not even a mother's love. Your mother says to you, if you love me, you'll take out the garbage. If you love me, you'll feed the dog. So there's a sort of a cost to even that type of love. But after a while, I began to realize it was a lot easier to talk about the concept of slavery and to talk to people about what it's like to be a slave, because when you're a slave, you're told where to go and what to do, who to love, when to have children. You don't own anything. Everything belongs to the master. And I started to think about this in terms of closed source software. We are told when to upgrade and how many people could be on the system and things like that. And I realized what people were really looking for was control. Control over your life, control over what happens to you, control over how you do computing and everything. And they wanted to take back that control. And that is actually what free software is all about. So I'm going to introduce you to a few people on this slide. These are people I've met over the years. A lot of these people are a lot older now. They're successful in their industry. And I'll start with the person on the left-hand side. He is Eric Schroen. He is one of the three people who started Red Hat Software. And he's sitting on top of a robot, which is controlled by the Linux operating system and some artificial intelligence software to control it. The person in the black and white is Mark Spencer. He was a university student when he wanted to start a consulting company, but he realized he needed something called a private branch exchange, which is a telephone system that takes voicemail, handles calls, routes calls, things like that. But it was going to cost between $20,000 and $30,000 US for him to buy one. Instead, he decided to write software that he could put on an inexpensive PC to do the same thing. And that software became known as Asterisk. And Mark started a company called Digium, which gave away the software, but charged for consulting and hardware that was necessary to do it. And after a few years, he sold that company for $350 million. The next person in the blue shirt is a person who I met in Madrid, Spain, at an event called Campus Party. He was 15 years old at the time, and he had the only distribution of Linux that could use your facial recognition to log in. He had a company, started a company to do that, and his father, who had been working for IBM for 30 years, quit his company to go work for his son. These are some of the people I want to talk to you about. The people who studied on their own, they decided they wanted to do something, and they did it, and they had the chance to do it because of free software and open hardware. We're going to go from Europe and the United States to Rio de Janeiro. This is the favela in Rio de Janeiro. It is a slum. It is what most people call a slum. but it is a place where people come from the countryside into the city in the hopes of having a job, in the hopes of finding employment, and not being able to find a place to live inside of the expensive normal living space. They went and built this favela of, slum types of things. But when you go there, you find out that the streets of the slum are very clean, that the people don't have anything or much, but what they do have, they take care of. And so I went to favela one time to meet somebody, and this is the person that I met. He had started as a bank janitor, a custodian, and he was sweeping up the bank one day when they were tossing out their computer systems. And he said, "Gee, could I have some of these computer systems and take them home?" And they said, "Well, yeah, okay, go ahead." So he took the computer systems home, he stored them in his house, and he learned about Linux and how to put Linux on these systems. And after a while, he said, I think that you would actually be able to have um, Wi-Fi inside the favela. And I could actually sell Wi-Fi inside the favela because inside the favela, there were small companies, small businesses that sold food or they sold handicrafts or things like that. And because they were not attached to the internet, they couldn't get their businesses to be seen on the outside. And so people laughed at him. They said nobody would ever pay you for having Wi-Fi in the favela. He says, well, I think they would. And so he reconfigured his computer systems to make them routers. He designed his own antennas to be able to, transmit the Wi-Fi. And a few years later, he had 6 people working for him full time, selling Wi-Fi inside the favela. He sold that off, and he decided he wanted to open up a small school to teach systems administration and web design. And so he applied for grants from the government. The government gave him enough money to have a small school of about 30 seats. And that is when I met him. And he was showing me his school and things like that when one of his students showed up. And I looked at this student and I looked into his eyes and I could see intelligence and I could see drive. And when I turned to my friend said, maddog, they used to talk about guns and drugs, and now they talk about the internet and web design. After a few years, he left that job and he went to work for the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, doing research in IoT and how to control traffic lights and how to control water movement inside of the city of Rio. And he is still working for them. So these are people who had nothing but drive and the interest in creating free software and open hardware. Here's another example, also from Brazil. This was a high school that had no funds for computers in their labs. If you're in schools in Brazil, you might have a private school, which has a lot of money that comes from the parents, paying for the children to go there, or you have a public school, which typically does not have enough funding for things like a computer lab. So the teacher decided that he was going to gather up a lot of systems that were being upgraded by banks or upgraded by industry, bring them to the classroom, take them apart, put them on shelves. You can see some of the shelves in the background there, and teach his students how to reconfigure those computers into something that was usable. So if they only had 2 megabytes of RAM, he would go in and reconfigure them to be 4 megabytes of RAM or 6 megabytes of RAM. And yes, I said megabytes, not gigabytes. He would, take out disk drives and make it so that they had enough disk space inside of the computers. And then he was able to create an entire lab for his students free of charge of the taxpayers. However, he did one other thing. He gave the students pride in the fact that they themselves built this lab for their own use. And that's something you can't buy with money. And one of the reasons why I'm showing you this slide today, because we're going through a period right now where there's over 400 million Windows 10 systems that will not be able to be upgraded to Windows 11. And people may get the idea, I'm just going to throw these away. I'm just going to throw them into garbage heap. But instead, if you put Linux on them, you will find out that you have a very workable computer, a very fine computer that could run Linux, and you don't have to pay any more license fees. You can use free software to run on top of the system to do almost anything you want. With all of this, I'm now going to move to the issue of sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean? Sovereignty is the same word as saying you're in control. You're in control of what happens to your data. You're in control of what happens to your computer system. It's not in the control of somebody else. You are a sovereign. You are a king in your own land. And the issue of sovereignty has been under attack for a long time. My country, the United States, has had threats of embargo. We've had an embargo against Cuba for over 60 years. We say that Cuba cannot use any of our technology, and we make sure that companies do not sell things to Cuba that are technological. This gives a political isolation to these countries because they can't really interact with everybody else. And this is a big threat to them. There's also a trade imbalance of hardware and software. Countries like Spain send money to the United States for an operating system that is closed source that runs on a lot of PCs. And that company that sells that operating system makes $20 billion a year for putting their operating system on top of these PCs. Do you really think it costs them anywhere near $20 billion a year to maintain that operating system? Probably not. It's just money that is being sent by Spain, by England, by Germany, by South America to this country, to this company, for basically doing nothing. And likewise, there's also a big imbalance in hardware. A lot of money is sent to China, is sent to the United States for hardware that the money could be spent inside of your country, giving work to your people, giving jobs to your people, to allow this trade imbalance to be more equal. And so these are things that enter into sovereignty. There are other issues of sovereignty. My country, I love my country, I really do. But there are elements inside of my country that spy on other countries. Every country spies on other countries. It's a natural thing, but you still don't like it. You still don't want it to happen. And so after September the 11th, 2001, we formulated a law called the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act gives entities inside the United States, like the CIA, like the NSA, the right to spy on people that are not in the United States. Theoretically, I am protected as a U.S. citizen by my Constitution from my country spying on me. In order to spy on me, they have to go to a court, they have to get a search warrant, and they have to convince the judge that they have a reason to suspect that I am some type of criminal. However, they don't have to do that for you, who are not a U.S. citizen. And if I am talking to you, then I give up my right to that privacy because I am talking to a potential terrorist, if you wish. So this Patriot Act is something which can easily take away your sovereignty. Likewise, there's something called a man-in-the-middle attack. The internet goes through many routers, going particularly from South America to Europe or from Europe to the United States. And my country can manage to get into the middle of this stream of data. We have things called VPNs, virtual private networks. They're supposed to protect us from that, supposed to make it so that people can't spy on what we're doing. However, if you put enough computer power towards them, you can even break a VPN. We'll get more into that in a little bit. And finally, there's denial of service attacks, where you attack a server or you attack a router in such a way that you shut down that stream of information. And this could be done as a way of espionage against other countries. There's also restrictions on certain technologies going into different countries. So the United States has restrictions on encryption. I went through several periods of this time back in the 1990s. Actually, in the 1980s, I was involved with some encryption that was in the Unix operating system. We were told we could not ship this encryption to countries outside of the United States, even countries that we thought of as allies. Great Britain, for instance. We were told we can't ship this encryption to Great Britain. We finally were able to work around that, but the encryption that was under control was so weak and miserable and such single-purpose encryption that it was ludicrous that anybody would want to deny this. Nevertheless, it was denied. Later on, there was another thing of the RSA encryption. Some of you know this as PGP encryption or GPG encryption if you're in the GNU code. This is a very effective public-private key encryption method that over the years started out with a 1024-bit key, and then as computers got faster and more aggressive, it went to 2048, and finally 4096 bits in the key, which is more or less the standard today. However, this encryption was also restricted back in the 1990s, and there was a big fight to get this encryption encryption laws changed, which fortunately Bill Clinton did do that as president. Why was this so important? It's important because you need to authenticate who you're talking to. Who are you talking to? And the problem of that is that encryption is the basis of authentication. And so if you don't have encryption, it's really hard to do authentication as to who you're talking to. And if you don't know who you're talking to, it could be the enemy. So it was important that our allies be able to use this encryption for authentication. And in reality, as we argued, everybody who was our enemy already knew how to do encryption. And so we really weren't stopping anything by denying them either the algorithms or the knowledge of how to do it, because they already do it. Another restriction was in powerful processing units. Even today, there are certain processing units, certain CPUs and GPUs, and things like that, which are restricted from going to certain countries. China, for instance, has just had some restrictions lifted on them for having certain types of GPUs sent to them, but there still are restrictions. And this is another lack of sovereignty. You should be able to use any CPU or any GPU that you wanted to. And then we get down to things like that are coming up, such as quantum computing and artificial intelligence. Quantum computing is interesting for several reasons. Number one, quantum computers are in the process of still being developed, but the time was that we thought that quantum computing might be 20 years out, and then it was 10 years out, and 5 years out, and now it looks like quantum computing could be here in 2 years. Why is this important? Because quantum computers are so fast doing certain algorithms that they could decrypt the things that a conventional computer would take thousands of years to decrypt in a matter of minutes. And so the information which we have that we think is safe because we have encrypted it may be pulled out, by people cracking into our systems, and they pull the data out and they store it for the time that quantum computers are going to be feasible. And then they will be able to decrypt that data and get all the secrets that we think are safe. Secrets like passkeys, secrets like names and addresses, and secrets like records of, who does what that we really thought was safe. Banking information we thought was safe. And so quantum computing is a threat, but what will happen is people will try to restrict who can have quantum computers. Will they be governments? Will it be very rich people, oligarchs, who have enough money to be able to build a quantum computer of their own? We need to be able to have sovereignty from these people. And likewise, AI. AI has been a catchword, and everybody looks at AI and says, oh, it's good for people because we'll make things cheaper or make things better or whatever. But AI is also a threat. And AI could also be limited as to what country or what group can use it or not. This is another area where you need sovereignty. So what are the types of needs that you have for sovereignty? Well, the very first one is local storage of your data. Because if your data is not stored in your own country, then the data may be under the laws of not only your country for what you do with it, but some other country where it is stored. And a lot of the vendors of cloud have taken steps to fix this problem. So AWS or Microsoft or Google have servers in various countries so that the data is now completely under the sovereignty of that country, except the company that owns AWS, the company that owns Google, the company that owns, all these different cloud services are typically US-based companies. And that means that even though the data may be stored in your country, if somebody from the United States could go to these companies with a court order and say, you need to show us what this data looks like. You need to give us access to this data. And with that court order, the company, whether it be Apple or whether it be IBM or whether it be anybody, would have two choices: either to obey the court order and give them access to the data, or deny the court order and go to jail. Recently, Apple was approached by the US government to say, we would like you to put some traps into your operating system, into your phones, to be able to capture data from people making calls. And Apple refused to do that, at least as far as we know. We will never know for sure, because that information is locked inside of Apple. You also need to be able to isolate your data from other people's data. One of the big things about AI is that as you use AI, you put information into AI, AI learns from the data which you put in. Well, if that AI model is shared with your adversary, your competitor, then your competitor may be finding out things about your business or about your government or about your society that you don't want them to do. You don't want them to learn. And so what you need to do is, if you use a large language model, you need to make sure that that large language model is isolated from all the other large language models so that your data is not going into it. You need to have local laws, good local laws of privacy and security, but you don't want to have to mingle them in with the laws of another country. You want your local laws of privacy and security to be what affects you. And so again, this is the sovereignty of your laws of privacy and security that are most important to you, because you have control over them. You vote for them. You vote for your legislators. You vote for the people leading your country, and you vote for the people who make those laws. You don't have any effect on the laws of the United States. You also want to have local control of your DNS systems and the routing of your data to make sure that people can't cut this off from you, that people can't cut you off from the hierarchy of the internet. And you need to think, as you create your systems, about having security first, not as an afterthought. One of the nice things that people like about the cloud is that you can get an account on one of the cloud computers, and you can then log into the cloud computer with your login name and your password. You have access to that cloud computer. The problem with this is that everybody else can have access to that cloud computer, given the same two things, the login name and the password. And when they have access to that, they could get access to the cloud from any place in the world. So the better thing would be that there was no access to the cloud using that, but the cloud itself actually had to reach out to you and to say, okay, I'm going to attach to you, which in a way is what two-factor authentication is. I first attach to the cloud, or I try and attach to the cloud, and then the cloud comes back to me and says, okay, you tried to attach to me, but I'm going to really attach to you. I'm going to really come back to you and say, are you really the person who you think you are? And so this is security first. It's an extra step. It's a little more of a pain that you have to do this, but it's necessary in a world where people break in all the day, where passwords, huge numbers of passwords, are found out by the bad people. So you need to think about security first when you're building your systems. You need to think about, am I exposing my server to all sorts of bad things coming in? Or can I reduce what we call the attack vector on the server by reducing the way that people can access it, even though it's harder for us to use it, but reduce the way they can attack the server to make the server more secure. And finally, we need to have quantum resistant encryption. All of the data which we've encrypted over the years using RSA, it's great right now, but as soon as the first quantum computer comes out, it's going to be accessible. And unfortunately, it's actually going to be accessible right now. Because again, what happens is people are breaking into server systems, they're capturing the data, they're storing it, and actually they're even selling it to other people. They may not have a quantum computer themselves, but they're taking that data and selling it on the black market to other people who are willing to pay them for that data and hold on to it until they get access to a quantum computer, and they can decrypt it, they can find the data that's inside of it, and they can sell that data to other people or use that data themselves. So all of these things are sovereignty needs that we need to think about. And finally, what I really want to talk to you about too is using free software in universities and high schools to teach data processing, to teach computers. I've been talking with university professors now for close to 30 years about, why don't you use Linux? Why don't you use Linux to teach your students? They say, oh, maddog, everybody uses Microsoft. Everybody uses Microsoft Office, so we need to teach our students how to use that so that our students are knowledgeable when they go to get a job. And I say, there's a problem with that thought. The problem is that your students are smart enough to build bridges or run governments or do brain surgery. They're smart enough to do all those things, but yet they're not smart enough that, having known how to use computers, can't pick up a book on Microsoft Office if they need to and learn it in a single day. You can't have it both ways. Either the students are smart or the students are dumb. And I think your students are smart. I think your students could be taught how to use LibreOffice, how to use Linux, and if they have to, be able to go over to use Microsoft Office in a day or two. So I say that closed source software actually teaches your students how to solve problems. It does. How do you use Microsoft Office to create a document, to create a presentation? How do you use Oracle, for example, to do an SQL database to store data? All these things are true. However, you also need to say, that free software could teach you the same thing. Free software also teaches you how to solve problems, but it also teaches you how the software solves those problems. It also teaches you how to make the software solve the problems better. So free software teaches you 3 times, not just once. And you need to think about that if you're a university professor, and particularly a university professor that wants to teach sovereignty. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm told I have a question and answer session in real time afterwards. And I will be here for your questions and to talk to you. Thank you.